Hey everyone, it's Scott from certmedia.com. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to remove unused CSS in WordPress. This topic has gotten extremely popular around this past week, mostly due to Core Web Vitals being released, and it's an issue most people get flagged on their WordPress websites. So we're going to be going over what the warning is, what you can realistically do, and at what point you should start being concerned, and really what you're able to do without systemically rebuilding your website or having to go through a lot of janky methods. So there's two main methods that you can go through cleaning up your unused CSS in WordPress. What I'm going to do real quick is I set up the staging website. It's running GeneratePress, and I went ahead and I just installed some random plugins, WooCommerce, bbPress, a couple of block plugins, just to cover the spread of what you may run into on your average WordPress website. WooCommerce is installed but not set up. I didn't do the basic configuration. As you can see though, it scores a 82, but what we're really concerned with here is we have this remove unused CSS warning, and we're going to be looking at our total style sheet count. We have 16 style sheets and 91 kilobytes of CSS. If this was merged as a single file, then the warning would increase because remove unused CSS, the measurement's typically determined by the total file size of an individual file. So let's say we merge it all to one file that was 91 kilobytes, it would probably get a red warning because let's just say 4 kilobytes of actual CSS is used for the page. So we're going to go through two methods that you can use on your WordPress website. There are pros and cons to both of them. The first one's going to involve you having to clean up the files manually or using a plugin. For this, I'm going to be using Perfmatters. Perfmatters is a paid plugin, but it's a great plugin. It does its job very well, and it's incredibly easy to use. We're going to go ahead and talk about how this plugin can help you with cleaning up your assets in general. So the general configuration, we're not going to worry too much here, but we're going to disable emojis, embeds, things that don't really matter, just to clean up the header a little bit. Now here's your first one that may actually help you remove unused CSS. Particularly for Divi users, dash icons will load on the front end, but you don't really need it to. Dash icons can load around 35 kilobytes of compressed CSS, mostly because it embeds the font in the CSS, which is just not the most efficient way to do font loading, but that's what WordPress has chosen to do for dash icons. I recommend checking this option. If you're not using Divi, particularly those on Genesis, just make sure you check that your menu icons are still loading because that's typically the most common use case for dash icons. This will only disable dash icons if you're not logged in as well. So if you have backend functionality for someone logging in, that will still load the icons as you expect. But this is a good way of trimming a substantial amount of CSS. This website shouldn't be loading that in the first place, so we don't really need to be concerned with it, but it is something I recommend enabling. That's about all that there really is on the front page. Since we are using WooCommerce though, we have the ability to disable WooCommerce scripts, but this also disables WooCommerce style sheets from loading on most pages. Now, one note, it will not remove the WooCommerce block CSS. We will have to do that individually, but I'll show you how to do that in the script management tool. So we're going to enable this option. And I also disabled the status meta box just so that way it helps backend performance, but this is totally optional. It has nothing to do with removing unused CSS. I don't disable cart fragmentation because if you're going to employ any sort of page caching, you're going to need the Ajax cart fragment script in order for the cart to update while maintaining page caching. If you don't use cart fragments, then you're going to have to not cache your pages after somebody adds an item to cart. In my experience, the overhead of doing that tends to outweigh the short-term performance benefits of disabling the cart fragment script. You can also choose to disable Google fonts. I'm not going to do that for this video. While it can help you remove unused CSS, that's not a major concern. Even very large amounts of Google fonts loading on the front end only accounts for a couple of kilobytes of CSS. You can't clean up the files yourself. It just doesn't matter either because the transfer size of the style sheets is incredibly small. So we're going to ignore that. I see that advice thrown around a lot. It's also going to make it where your website just looks quite terrible if you used a good chunk of Google fonts for loading on the front end, so just keep that in mind. Now, the one thing we're really here for is the asset cleanup tool called the Script Manager. So we're going to enable it under the Extras tab. Now, for this website, as I went over it, we have a couple of plugins on here. We have Jetpack, which is going to add a good chunk of CSS. bbPress, which is a forum plugin. even though it's not actively used. I'll show you how to clean it up. Contact Form 7, which as I've gone over on my blog, Contact Form 7 does not need to load on all pages. I don't know why they choose to do that, but it is. We're going to clean that one up. I have Generate Blocks and Generate Blocks Pro. These ones are out of date. Sorry for that, but we're going to show you how you can try to optimize these, but these plugins are actually very well written, so you don't have to do much for them. Genesis Blocks, which we'll go over again briefly. Generate Press Premium, which will have no impact on this. Happy Forms, which is another Forms plugin, and that's something I'm going to suggest right now. If you're using multiple Forms plugin, no matter what it is, if it's Gravity Forms, AR Forms, Ninja Forms, Contact Form 7, consolidate them. Only use one because it's going to be easier for you to manage, and it's going to cut out a lot of JavaScript and CSS. It also just makes your life easier from maintaining. Jetpack, which Jetpack is a bit difficult to clean up, but I will just go over the Jetpack plugin briefly. Nova Share, which is adding share icons, Perfmatters, a preloader to add a nice little loading effect, the events calendar, which is allowing you to add events to the front end of your website, and WooCommerce, which we've already started to clean up using Perfmatters. I also have WordPress which will be used for the secondary method that I'm going to go over briefly towards the end, but that one's an automatic method, and we're going to talk about the issues you're going to run into with that, but it can make your life easier. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to reload the home page, and now there will be a new option at your top of your bar. It's going to be called the Script Manager tool. This does allow you to optimize style sheets as well. And what we're basically going to do here is we're just kind of use common sense. One of the issues with trying to use automated tools for cleaning up unused CSS is they tend to break things, quite frankly, because styles don't necessarily load on the initial load when somebody is scanning the front end. So tree shaking algorithms tend to work where they scan the front end of the website. They try to find all the used selectors, but not all used selectors apply immediately. Some apply only on hover events, for instance. Some may only apply to mobile devices. So depending on how the tree shaker is running, it may have issues with mobile styles. We're going to keep this all in mind here, but we, as the user, know what we're using on our page. So like this home page, for instance, we know the preloader script is being used, and it's being used on every page, but you know what's not being used? Contact Form 7. So we don't need to load Contact Form 7 in this scenario on this page. Now we have two ways of going about this. We could choose to either just disable the scripts, which involves just clicking over here and disabling it on the current URL, or we can use what's called the MU mode. MU mode will basically set this plugin to a higher level of priority to where it can disable not only just the CSS and the JavaScript files, it could disable the plugin entirely from processing on that page. This can remove secondary style sheets and JavaScript that may be loading in a non-standard in-queue fashion. So if we enable this, dependent scripts may also no longer load. In the case of Contact Form 7, it loads several additional JavaScript files as dependencies of Contact Form 7 right here. But if we choose to use MU mode, we don't need to load that anymore. So for reference, we are starting off with 16 style sheets, it looks like, for this website. We'll go ahead and run it one more time. But really, that's the key thing we're worried about here. We're going to go ahead now and let's just start. BB Press is the Forms plugin. We know that it's not being used on this page, so we can go ahead and disable it. We don't need it on this URL. We could choose to disable it everywhere and then whitelist pages that we know it's going to be used on. In this scenario, we know it's only going to be used really on BB Press pages on this particular website because it's very rare that websites even embed BB Press on specific pages. Some websites will embed them on pages basically using the shortcode function. If you're doing that, you'll know that, in which case it's better to just disable it on the URLs that it's not being used on. But in this case, we know it's only going to be used on the forums and the respective post types for it. So we're going to disable it. From there, Contact Form 7, as we touched on, is not being used. But we can actually do this in a very efficient way. Let's say I'm only using my Contact Form plugin on my contact page, which makes a lot of sense. So what we could do instead is we can go back to our script manager and say, Contact Form 7, I'm only using you in one spot. There's no reason for you to load anywhere else. So we could just choose to disable it everywhere and only whitelist it for that given URL. Now, I have installed multiple form plugins, so we're going to kind of do the exact same thing for Happy Forms, which isn't loading anything at the moment. But that is something to keep in mind. when it comes to cleaning up your form plugins, it's easier in most cases if you're only using them on a couple of pages to just disable it everywhere and whitelist it for the existing current URL that you're looking at. So we're going to close this now and just return back to my homepage and reload, and it should automatically update that contact form 7 is not being loaded on this page. So Genesis blocks, we know Genesis blocks is being used on this website. We're assuming so, that you've probably used some block from Genesis blocks. But one thing that we know is not being used at all is fontawesome in this use case. Fontawesome is not being loaded anywhere on this front end. We have no icons that come from it. So we don't necessarily need to load it. This icon at the bottom is actually part of a logo. So we don't need to worry about loading fontawesome. That's 45 kilobytes of CSS. We'll disable it from this URL. If we know we're not using fontawesome anywhere, then it'd be safe to go ahead and disable it everywhere. Just keep this in mind. If you disable it everywhere and you are using an icon, the icon will no longer load. It will show an empty square. So if you disable fontawesome everywhere, keep that in mind that you will break your icons if they are actually being used. In this case, we're just disabling it everywhere because this website's not going to be using it. We will leave the default Genesis block styles solely because with this style sheet, Genesis blocks dynamically injects this CSS everywhere. It doesn't figure out what blocks are being used on what page and segments them. Some blocks plugins will do this and they'll build the CSS dynamically. I think Ultimate add-ons for Gutenberg may do this, not 100% positive, but some of them are starting to do it. And it is something that's actually being suggested for the core blocks as well. But for now, it's not being done. This is something I believe they're working on as well. But we are going to leave it on because if we disable it and one block is being used, it's going to appear broken. And the only way to load this is to load this file in its entirety. And there's not really a way for you to go in and manually clean it up unless you take inventory of every single block that you're using. For GP Premium, we know we're using all of these items, so we're going to keep them enabled. And they're also very lightweight and small, so we're not too worried about it. Now, for Jetpack, Jetpack is a particularly interesting plugin. It has multiple functionalities. In this case, though, we know we're not using anything from Jetpack on the home page. We're not using Jetpack forms, and we're not using any of the Jetpack share icons or additional functionality. We'll disable it for this URL just to clear the CSS. Just again, you have to take inventory. Jetpack has a lot of blocks and a lot of functionality. If you load it and you're not sure if a functionality is being used or not, it's probably safer to leave it. But this is 71 kilobytes of non-compressed CSS. So we can still strip that out and it's probably going to be safe. The events calendar is a smart plugin. The events calendar does not load any of its assets unless it knows that a calendar is being used on that page, which is excellent foresight on their point on their development team. I really just included this to illustrate certain plugins will optimize the loading of their assets depending on the pages that they're actually being used on. This is a great example of one. More plugins should do this. Contact Form 7 is a keen example of one that should probably do that. And there are some other form plugins that are also just as guilty as Contact Form 7. It's just the most popular. That's why I make a comparison out of it. For Generate Press, which is the theme, this is a scenario you're probably going to run into. Most of your themes, particularly off-the-shelf themes on ThemeForest, is a really big one. They'll just load one large style sheet. You don't really have a good way of removing that because you can assume that the style sheet that's being used, if it's really large, it's where all the CSS lives. There may be accompanying additional style sheets, but really, a lot of them just merge all the CSS into one style sheet, which is far less than ideal because it makes it harder to clean up and to load them conditionally. It is something that a lot of theme authors are taking note of though, particularly since they're getting hammered with negative reviews and critiques due to Core Web Vitals being an important ranking factor, or just one of 100 ranking factors rather. So in the event of your main style sheet, it's best to just go ahead and leave it. The automated tools can help clean that up, but we're gonna have to touch that here towards the end since we're almost getting there. Then we can go ahead and look here. The WordPress block library CSS. If you're not using blocks at all, which a lot of sites still aren't, believe it or not, from my experience, it's quite common, particularly with those who had developers build them advanced custom fields websites pre-WordPress 5.0. The block library CSS, even if you're using the classic editor, will still load. Go ahead and disable it here if you can and you're comfortable with doing so. If you're using any sort of blocks though, just go ahead and leave it. The block library CSS, while it's 56 kilobytes uncompressed, it's still very valuable. It handles most of the blocks in WordPress, and now that blocks will be used for your sidebar widgets in the new 5.8 update. Just don't go removing the core CSS. They are aware of the performance impacts of this, and they are working to improve it. But if you disable it and you use a columns block, an image block, whatever default core block you're using, you've now taken all the CSS out of it. It's not even that big of a file in total size if you just view and open it. Yes, it has 56 kilobytes uncompressed, but that's quite small. Oftentimes, larger themes on ThemeForest, I see 900 kilobytes of uncompressed CSS. That is where you run into substantial performance issues with CSS processing. But we're going to leave this because I am using blocks. This is a block-facing theme with GeneratePress. We're going to go ahead now and reload the page and just see if anything appears broken. Still got that weird loading icon that I threw on there for the sake of demonstration. Really, everything is right. The only thing that is kind of busted, and it's because I was fiddling with it when I probably should have known better, and it is the these buttons down here. I messed with the styles and I busted them, but that was not because of the CSS. This was done off screen. Either way though, we'll go ahead and now we will rerun PageSpeed Insights just to see the total difference in file size. And then we're gonna talk about your secondary method. So the secondary method would be to use something like Swift Performance, or WordPress Rocket. Some of the other plugins, Auto Optimize has a remove unused CSS tool. Now, these tools are great because it takes a lot of the manual cleanup out of the picture. Looks like we have page caching going on the server, so we'll just go ahead and activate WordPress Rocket and clear it. But what you're going to run into is these plugins are very handy, except for when the tree shaking algorithm breaks something, and then it becomes a very time-consuming to fix. My general rule of thumb is if you have a website that's not overly complicated, doesn't rely too much on animations, and doesn't rely on a lot of hover effects and transition effects, they'll probably play fine. For instance, my website actually did work fine with this remove unused CSS tool. It is a beta functionality, but it can cause breakages. So what the tool does is it loads all your pages and it sends them off to WordPress Rocket server. Swift Performance does basically the same thing. It sends them off to their server. They then simulate a browser going to the website, and they, in the same way that Chrome has a unused CSS detector, it basically works off the same principle. It checks the page and it says, this is all the total amount of used CSS. And then it spits that back to your server. Your server says, okay, and then that's what it loads on the front end. The problem with this is that, again, it can't find all the CSS. Oftentimes things break. Common issues that I've seen since this feature started rolling out, because WordPress Rocket is so popular, I get to see a lot of users who are having issues with it. You see menu icons, for instance, being broken, particularly those in the sub-navigation, if the sub-navigation has a different icon than the top-level navigation. You see mobile sites in particular suffer because unless you have the cache separate cache for mobile devices, it doesn't separate the used CSS for those devices. It will just generate one global used CSS. Transition and hovers have also been broken, and that's just because it's part of the nature of being rather difficult to detect CSS rules that are dependent on user interaction. So for instance, you hover over this, and as you can see, the LinkedIn icon went from being invisible to the blue. So it's probably supposed to be a different color, and I just broke it. But that's an example of where a hover effect may not be able to be captured by the tree shaker. And obviously, as time goes on, they'll be able to improve it and add whitelisting for different types of pseudo elements so that way you're less likely to run into breakages. But you're always going to have to test whenever you use an automated tree shaking tool. Depending on the complexity of your website too, this process can take a while. Some users have said that this has taken hours for the process to run. I suspect that their server was probably offline or in a maintenance mode for it to take hours, or they had an extremely large website, because that's where issue number 2 comes in. The remove unused CSS tool has to work on every single page. The tool will scan It'll take all your known publicly facing pages, it'll put them in the database, and then it will send it. WordPress Rocket will then have to scan every single page. If you're on a hosting plan too, where your database is limited, so SiteGround, for instance, will limit you up to, I think it's about a gig if you're on GoGeek as the total size of your database. Let's say you never ran into that issue, but you have 1,000 pages. It can eat away on your total database size rather quickly if you have a very large website with very little traffic, which sounds a little odd, but it does happen quite often with either sites that are just creating content because that'll help them from an SEO perspective, or sites that offer a lot of products, for instance, and doesn't have very many sales. Keep this in mind. This tool is going to take a good chunk of time to run, but it is very effective at what it does. It's almost too effective. So we can go to my website real quick. We'll just open them up. We'll go to certmedia.com, and I've used this tool right here. So at the top, you could see that I have WordPress Rocket used CSS. I used this and I tested it, and I was actually debugging issues with them. And that's why I use my public-facing website more often than not for diagnosing issues before I test them on a client website, for instance. But this was an issue where, for instance, the Jetpack, I was using Jetpack stats. And the Jetpack emoji, it loads a little icon via JavaScript. So the icon doesn't actually load in right away. The tool wasn't able to detect the icon. So after using this tool, the emoji, the little smiley face that loads in the header and the footer, but's invisible, started appearing. And that's because it didn't know to load the CSS for that icon because it didn't load with the page, it loads with JavaScript. And that's the type of scenario where something will happen, where if you have any type of element that depends on JavaScript to be processed, or AJAX is another common one. The good thing about AJAX requests is a lot of times people embed the style sheets that are necessary in the AJAX request. So you're less likely to run into issues there, but you can still run into them depending on how they're loading the style sheets for the AJAX request. They may just not get styled, and you may have elements that do not appear correctly. And the unfortunate part is you either have to try and find the style sheet rules and try to whitelist them inside WordPress Rocket's plugin. Swift has a similar system as well. And then it will try to fix it by regenerating it or appending the rules to the remove unused CSS that's been inlined. Or you might just have to disable the feature altogether. And that's kind of the opportunity cost here. You're automating it by taking it completely out of your hands and the tool is scanning it for you, but you're more likely to run into issues. But when it works, it's great. I think it removed, my website was loading around 30 kilobytes of compressed CSS prior. Post, the inline total amount of style CSS that was loading was around 11 kilobytes. Your mileage may vary, particularly if you have very heavy themes, but remember, the larger the style sheets that you're working with, the more likely you are to run into issues because it just adds more complexity and more things to check for. That's really your two ways of reducing unused CSS in WordPress. You can either try to clean up your plugins or use better plugins. That's a great opportunity as well. If you're using, let's say, third-party share buttons with the JavaScript that embeds, and it loads a lot of CSS for those buttons, oftentimes just because of technical debt, using something like NovaShare, which is very lightweight, can reduce your CSS and give you similar functionality. That's a common thing I'll do. If I see websites using share this icons, sure, I could just choose to not load the JavaScript on certain pages, but it's more performant to just not use share this and instead use something like NovaShare. It won't look the same, but it gives you the same effect and they still look good while being significantly more lightweight. Another thing you can do is always consolidate plugins. This is something I see a ludicrous amount of times on websites that I work on. I'll go to them and I'm like, why are you using 3 different forms plugins when you are paying for 2 of them? Just consolidate them into one. For instance, if you're paying for Gravity Forms and you have all the form logic, conditional logic, and any other thing that you would really not want from Gravity Forms, there's no reason for you to pay for Ninja Forms and also pay for the Ninja Forms conditional logic. It's just a waste of money. And it's also a waste of your site's performance because now you're loading additional CSS and JavaScript that was not necessary. Consolidate your plugins, use smarter plugins, then you can always just use Perfmatters to clean up the plugins that are loading, or you could just try and use an automated tool like the one found in WordPress 3.9. No matter which way you go with, it's always better to just start off on a better footing. If you're going to use WordPress Rocket, that does not negate the fact that you should not be using share this share buttons. You should just use something lighter like NovaShare. That's just the fact of the matter. If you are using WordPress Rocket and it does work, congrats. That is good for you. You now have very little CSS. If you find yourself still loading a large CSS, which can happen, I've seen around 40 kilobytes in some larger websites that I've tested on, you're really then just going to have to look at either having a more efficient theme. GeneratePress, Genesis are great frameworks. Highly recommend them. Or you're going to have to drop some plugins and or functionality that may be adding the unused assets. That's really about all I have for this video. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to ask in the comments below. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.